Fortunately, my sermon today is about the perils of trying to figure out things all by yourself. Case in point. I am a big fan of cooking. I love cooking and composing dishes. I love this idea of taking various ingredients and composing them to make a dish that's kind of one part art, one part chemistry. And we even heard yesterday in our sermon at the wedding, at David and Nick's wedding yesterday, that I'm not the only one that delights in composing a dish from various ingredients and seeing what magic happens. I was advanced enough in cooking, just enough so to start getting myself in trouble, though, thinking that I knew too much about how to go it alone. And a couple of decades ago, I was trying my hand at a macaroni and vegetable casserole for the first time and thought, I can forego any recipes, I can go it alone. And I knew enough to melt the butter, to start making my cheese sauce, my roux. I melted the butter, added a little bit of flour, began incorporating the broth, adding a little bit of a cheese at a time to make the sauce, not too fast, right, so as to not have it congeal on me. And that's where I started to run into trouble. Because I poured my cheese sauce into the pasta, added my broccoli, put it into the casserole dish, and what I didn't realize at the time was I hadn't cooked the vegetables thoroughly enough, and they all began to release their liquid into the casserole and begin to turn it into a kind of a soupy mess. And in a panic, I thought, cornstarch! That'll help with the liquid. I'll add cornstarch to it. And it soaked up the liquid, not realizing, of course, that the pasta had not finished soaking up all of its liquid, and then it all began to dry out. Now it was too dry. And much like Peter, in a panic, realizing he's sinking, looking for help, I thought, I'll add more water. So I began pouring more water into the casserole. And by that point, the vegetables had all released their liquid, the pasta had finished absorbing its liquid, and I had a soupy mess of somehow both undercooked and burnt pasta with cheeseburgers floating in the casserole with cornstarch. And unlike Peter, when I cried out to the Lord for being saved, Jesus did not swoop into my kitchen and rescue my casserole at the last minute. But it is a reminder to me, and I think a good illustration, about the peril of thinking we know so much that we can just go it alone. In the gospel reading for today, we hear this iconic story of Jesus walking on the water. And it's such a vivid image. We all have this picture of Jesus Christ walking along the water. We frequently refer to people who are quite holy as that person's so holy they walk on water. And Jesus is out there. The boat is being tossed to and fro, out of control. The disciples are barely hanging on, and in their fright, Jesus is coming to their rescue. They don't recognize him at first. They think he's a ghost. But there's Jesus walking on the water to them. And Peter, in his excitement, decides to get out and start trying to walk on the water toward Jesus, thinking, I can just do this. And he begins to go it alone. He gets out of the boat without his fellow disciples trying to get along in the water and just starts walking on his own toward Jesus and begins to sink. I've heard this story preached many a time on this gospel story about the condemnation against Peter being that everything would have been fine if Peter had just had strong enough faith. That the condemnation against Peter was that he doubted or that he had a crisis of faith. And by implication to many of us, I've heard the story told that by implication to you too, that if your faith is just strong enough, you can walk on water. And if you're not able to do that, it's because you doubted or your faith is lacking. And I worry about the harmfulness in that message because, of course, if you were trying to walk on the water and you find yourself sinking, it might not be that there's anything wrong with you as a person for doubting, because we're all going to doubt. We're all going to struggle with our faith from time to time. The problem might actually just be that you're trying to walk on water. Now, I want to offer, in that way, an alternative condemnation against Peter, saying that maybe Peter, the problem in this story isn't that he doubted or he struggled in his faith, that the problem with Peter was that he jumped out of the boat and tried to walk on the water in the first place. And offer this up as a potential other way of looking at the story you can keep in your pocket as an alternative lesson to get from this. I offer some evidence toward that. One piece of evidence is that this is not the first time in the Gospel of Matthew somebody has called out Jesus and tried to command Jesus to do something for him. You know who the person who did it first in Matthew was? It was Satan. When Jesus was baptized and went out into the wilderness, the same language that Peter uses to call Jesus now is the same kind of language that Satan uses in the wilderness to try to get Jesus to do his bidding for him. And remember, the whole idea of Satan is not interested in using God's power to love each other or to uplift the kingdom there for one another. Satan's just interested in God's power for what it can do for me, how it can help me do what I want. Peter, likewise, wants to get out on the boat and calls out Jesus to say, "Do this for me, Jesus, because I want to go walk out on the water." It's an interesting thought. The same Peter who Jesus more than once has had to say, "Get behind me, Satan, your mind is on worldly things." The next idea. This is also not the first time in the Gospel of Matthew that Jesus has sent his disciples out into the choppy waters to be overwhelmed. It was just in Matthew chapter 8. He picked up his disciples. He sent them out in a boat on the water. The waves were crashing around. They were looking over the side. It was dark. It was stormy. They were overwhelmed. And Jesus, they look over at him. He's asleep. He's sleeping on the boat with them. And they're crying out to the Lord, "We're overwhelmed. Save me, Lord." And they wake up Jesus, and he quiets the waves. They weren't alone. As long as he was there with them, they weren't alone. And this is a recurring theme through the Bible. If you look at the story of Jonah, right? The story of Jonah is about God reaching out and sending Jonah out to do something scary and overwhelming, go to Nineveh. And he's worried, and he runs away, and where does he end up? He ends up in the waves, in the water, crashing about, uncertain and out of control, and he ends up in the water. But he's not alone. God sends the great fish to scoop him up and bring him back to shore where he's safe. Likewise, the story of Noah. The story of Noah, where it rained for 40 days and 40 nights, and Noah is there in his ark, and the waves are crashing around, and it's out of control and beyond him, and it must have been terrifying. But he wasn't alone. God sent the dove as a reminder, you're not alone. These waters will recede, and you'll be on dry land again. And so there's a long pattern in this that Jesus gets when he sends his disciples out into those waves yet again. And it will be frightening for them, and they will feel overwhelmed and out of control, but they will not be alone because they have each other, and they can trust in God. In fact, the only one that doesn't stay in the boat and trust in God is Peter, who jumps out of the boat and tries to go it alone. And he runs and he tries to run on the water, and he can do it just fine for a little while, and then begins to sink. And so it's no surprise when he calls out to Jesus and says he wants to do this, Jesus lets him try and says, "Come, give it a try. Let's see how this goes." And of course, he begins to sink. And when he does, he's not forsaken. Jesus scoops him up, puts him back on the boat where he was told to be, and then he calms the waters. So I think about in my own life, other times I've made the mistake of trying to go it alone, a time when, again, a couple of decades ago, in my 20s, the same time I was doing the thing with the macaroni and cheese. So apparently I needed to learn things the hard way. Because I had felt disillusioned with the institutional church and had felt it become hypocritical and judgmental, and thought, I'll just go it alone for a while, make my own church, do my own faith. And I was fine for a while, walking out on the water, until I began to sink and realized I can't go it alone. I need my people. I need to be reminded of God's presence with me. And I was brought with you all back into the boat, as it were. When I was the priest at St. Stephen's and Hurricane Harvey hit, and it was, again, the crashing waves and the water of the hurricane that flooded our church, flooded the parish hall, people's homes, and we were overwhelmed. It was beyond us. We can't do this, and it was beyond us. But we weren't alone. We had each other, and God was with us, and we rebuilt together. That's our story here at St. James in Chicago, when in 1871 it wasn't crashing waves, but for us it was a fire that swept through our city, burned our church down. 3 weeks after opening it up, 3 weeks later, burned our church to the ground, as well as the city around us, and people were overwhelmed. This is beyond us, Lord. And it was. But we weren't alone. We had each other, and we had our God, and we rebuilt. We rebuilt our church, we rebuilt our city, and here we are. Much, much later, the people in this room, when the coronavirus swept through, the pandemic swept through, much like a flood, took us away from our communities. We were hunkering down, overwhelmed and frightened, feeling alone. But we weren't alone. We had our God, we had each other, and here we are. Thriving, growing, taking care of one another, being community to one another. In the boat, as it were. And that's the work we continue to do. God will continue to send us out into the choppy waters, the stormy sea, because that's where we're called to go and be out in the world. Out in our city where there is too much violence and it's overwhelming what to do about it. Too many hungry mouths to feed and not enough time and money to do it. Too many projects we need to do to continue to raise funds to take care of our building and our organ and pass it on to future generations, and young children to teach, and new people to form, and divisions to heal. New people coming into our city who need someone to take them in and give them shelter and show them welcome. It is overwhelming, and it may feel like it's too much for us. But we are not alone. And as we do the work of raising the money we need to raise to take care of our space, bringing our children in and teaching them and forming them, spending our time and our effort feeding those who come to us who are hungry or in need of shelter or in need of love. As we continue to do that work, we can remind ourselves not to fall into the trap that Peter did, or I did, of jumping out of the boat or trying to cook the casserole all by myself, but to remember we've been given each other. And Jesus is here with us in that work we do. So let us continue to put ourselves out from shore, to continue to go out into those stormy seas. And it's all right to doubt and be afraid and feel overwhelmed sometimes. And those are the moments to remind ourselves we're here together and God is with us. Today, tomorrow, and the years to come. Thanks be to God. Amen.